Hello and welcome to our webinar this morning. My name is MacArthur and I'm head of the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, and I'll be your host today. Before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar will work best on Chrome, so if you're not on Chrome, maybe copy the link and move on to Chrome. It will work best there. If you've got any problems through the viewing of this through video or audio, just hit the refresh button and it should refresh the page and should work. You'll see on the right hand side we have a comments tab. If you could put questions in the comments tab throughout, then we'll be able to pick those up at the end of the session. Finally, just to let you know that the session will be recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channels and the Charter website, and it will also be sent to you after the event. The Charter is really happy, delighted to be working with the Greater Manchester LEP to deliver this webinar today, and what is a subject of great and I think probably increasing importance. In past times about a year ago maybe, I might have opened an event like this by asking for a show of hands of everyone in the audience who's feeling a bit tired, maybe a bit exhausted, or even burnt out. So after the experiences of the past year and the unrelenting pressures, change, uncertainty every day, I feel the majority of our virtual room today has probably got their hands in the air. In short, it's been a tough year, and we know it's taken its toll on mental well-being. The toll on mental well-being of everyone, our families, our employees, but also our leaders. And I think that's really interesting, an issue that's come forward perhaps in the last 3 or 4 months, certainly to our attention, my attention, that people who are leading organizations are going, me too, I need some attention here, this is tough. We are then extremely fortunate to be joined today by a range of contributors who have insight and expertise on the challenges we're facing. And hopefully offer some of the coping mechanisms that might just help us through. Today we're joined by Lou Cordwell. Lou is the Chief Executive of Magnetic North, but also I think the hat you're wearing today, Lou, is the Chair of Greater Manchester LEP. We're also joined by Gemma Soul, who's a partner at the School for CEOs, and David Soul, who's a founder and partner at the School of CEOs. We're delighted to have Gemma and David with us today, particularly because a little ahead of the curve, I think, Gemma and David, you commissioned some research last year, in September last year, published in September last year, looking at the psychological impact of COVID on business leaders, and really look forward to hearing your reflections on that research. And finally, and by no means least, Laura Earnshaw from My Happy Mind. Laura will provide some insight on how we can manage at a personal and organizational level. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Lou to open by providing some context for Greater Manchester on this agenda and the importance of our well-being as we consider and how we move forward to build back better. Lou, over to you.
Thanks, Ian. And as you say, perhaps a year ago, we couldn't have imagined that we'd be having a conversation about the economy and well-being all in the same webinar. So I think certainly one of our observations as the LEP and I guess as the voice of business and economy in the GM machine over the last 12 months has been what doesn't feel too surprising now, but at the time did feel a little bit surprising, was this realization that actually the health of our people and the health of our economy are intrinsically interconnected. So I think that's been a real lesson for us all as individuals and families, but also as business leaders, as we've started to think about the process of economic recovery and I guess the definition of success and what we're striving for, the new North Star as we describe it on the other side of this process. So as a LEP, we've taken the moment not just to deal with the firefighting and the immediate kind of support needed for business, just to help people stay alive, stay in a job, keep other people in a job, and keep moving forward. But also just to think really about our 5-10 year outlook beyond the local industrial strategy that we set out a year ago, really into being very clear on how we use what we describe as a bit of a reset moment that we feel we're in at the moment. And I think very early on, and I'm sure we'll hear this from Gemma and David today, you could see there was an RSA poll, I remember, only a month in, where only 9% of people wanted to return back to normal. So already very early on into this process, I think people had stepped off the treadmill and realised that perhaps they didn't want to return to exactly the way the world was before. And so I think we've set out in that time frame a very clear economic vision for Greater Manchester. And in that, we describe a definition of success that works for all people and works for the planet. So I think what we've seen is, as you're describing, Ian, a huge challenge for business. We're now a long way into that. If you're in Greater Manchester, it feels like we've been in lockdown pretty much for 12 months permanently. In some form or other. People are tired, people are worried, so it's different kinds of tiredness, isn't it? People might not be worried for their own job, but they might be worried for their partners. As business leaders, it's been exhausting. Everything seems to be, that dreaded word, unprecedented, so we're dealing with new kinds of challenge. And I think it's unprecedented both in the type of crisis, so we're dealing with a scale of economic challenge that none of us in our lifetime have ever dealt with before, whilst some of us have lived through recessions. The peripheral challenges that come with that, so you might have children at home, you might have parents who can't leave home and you're worried about them, but also the pace. So in reality, some of the changes that we've seen and the transformations in the economy were going to come anyway, but we did them in 10 months, not 10 years. So I think that scale and the kind of pace of that has been massively challenging and draining for people in businesses, people leading businesses. So I think, we really have set a very clear direction of travel for ourselves as an economy, and that's got a very clear definition of success. In that context, human well-being becomes incredibly important, not just because it's human capital and it helps us to achieve many of the growth ambitions that we have in those key sectors for our economy, but also by our definition of success. We see actually that it's incredibly important that people have a sense of well-being and happiness, which is a strange word again that I've never been allowed to use in economic forums before, but actually becomes incredibly important, not least because it's so interconnected with innovation, with productivity, with creativity, with all of those things that are in reality going to drive the next wave of our economic recovery. So we think this is a really important conversation to have, not just because in the near field, it's front and centre for a lot of business leaders who for the first time are having to grapple with the well-being of themselves and their teams, but also because it's going to be absolutely critical to how we achieve long-term economic growth. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Lou. That's a really useful overview, and I think it sets out the values that's informed the vision of the Greater Manchester economy moving forward, how we want to build back better. And I think credit to you, Lou. You did that really early on in the crisis, setting out that build back better message, and I think it's informed a lot of thinking as we move forward. So thanks to you for that. Let's quickly move on to Gemma, and I've already trailed the research which is informing a lot of the thinking. So Gemma, over to you.
Thanks, Ian, and good morning, everyone. And thanks, Ian, for inviting David and I to join the conversation today. I think I've got the mic for just over 10 minutes this morning. So in that time, I'd like to give you a whistle-stop tour of the research, what we learned about the psychological impact of COVID-19 on senior leaders, but also what helped them cope with the forced change of lifestyle and disruption to their business models. And finally, I'll wrap up by sharing our 3 recommendations to leaders. And David and I are both here to join the Q&A at the end, so we're happy to answer any further questions you might have then. So every piece of research begins with a rationale. So I think it's important to acknowledge ours. And the School for CEOs was set up 10 years ago to support the most senior leaders in business through coaching and open leadership development programs. And when news of the first lockdown came, business leaders immediately went into survival mode. Huge amounts of energy and time was being piled into preparing the workforce and business operations in a phase that we were referring to as hunkering down. Leaders, employees were all fueled by adrenaline at the novelty of the issue, but we were concerned about the impact on leaders once that adrenaline subsided. So no one knew how long we would feel the impact of the pandemic, and we know that a lack of certainty, loss of control, and loss of autonomy is the holy trinity for a stress response in individuals. So we wanted to know how well leaders coped with the responsibility or burden of leadership during this extended period of flux. And if leaders were expected to ensure the safety of their workforce and the future of their business, how were they ensuring that they themselves were fit and up to the task? And who was looking after them? So we partnered with a professor of business psychology at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, and we gathered data from over 700 business leaders to find out how high burnout levels were among executives, who was feeling it the most, and what was helping them cope. The World Health Organization elevated burnout to a diagnosable syndrome in 2019, perhaps a sign of its increasing prominence. And let's start just by defining it. Burnout syndrome is described as progressive loss of idealism, energy, and purpose. And actually, the main body of research around burnout looks at people in the helping professions who experience it as a result of their work conditions. And you can see on the screen here, there are two key facets that underpin burnout syndrome. Disengagement with work describes a negative attitude towards work. It's not necessarily a withdrawal, as the name may suggest. And secondly, exhaustion actually refers to emotional exhaustion. And this isolates the feeling of being emotionally drained rather than the type of physical exhaustion you might experience after exercise. The headline finding of our research was this: 42% of senior leaders were at a high risk of burnout during the first lockdown. So that's 2 in every 5 senior leaders. And of the 2 core facets that underpin burnout, leaders scored higher on emotional exhaustion. Beyond that, we explored gender differences, which uncovered that women scored slightly higher on overall burnout. But where we noticed statistically significant differences between men and women was on the emotional exhaustion facet. And this aligns with other studies that took place last year. In our study, 25% of female leaders living with school-aged children took full homeschooling responsibility for their kids. And we felt this was quite staggering given their leadership responsibility. And that 25% compares with only 3% of male leaders. And this statistic has parallels with a study in the US that revealed that 32% of fathers reported mental health challenges compared with 52% of mothers during the pandemic. So this raises concerns for us around another side effect of the pandemic in exacerbating the challenges that we already have around gender equality in the workplace and also in society at large. We also noticed differences in age, with younger leaders at much higher risk of burnout and emotional exhaustion compared with their older counterparts. So 3 in every 5 leaders younger than 38 years old experienced high burnout levels, and this number nearly halved in over 50s. And the final trend I wanted to touch on was to look at burnout by executive level. We invited CEOs, their executive teams, and execs teams to take part in the study. And what we discovered was that CEOs experienced the lowest burnout levels, despite being the ultimate individual accountable for the business's overall performance. So 22% of CEOs were at high risk of burnout, half our 42% average. We also noticed that CEOs expressed more positive emotions during lockdown than their executive teams. And there is a body of research telling us that optimism is a key trait among successful leaders. So perhaps this protected them during lockdown. Although you could oppose this thought with other theories. So, for example, they might have more information and therefore a broader perspective and a greater sense of control. They might also have less contact with those feeling most challenged by lockdown. It's line managers who are at the coalface trying to support and manage the emotional struggles and team dynamics when furlough was introduced, for example. But in the context of our overall data set, you could look at 22% and think CEOs are handling the situation pretty well, or they were handling the situation pretty well. But if you pause and take that data or that statistic out of context and look at 1 in 5 CEOs being at high risk of burnout during lockdown, to us, that was quite a concerning statistic. As I mentioned in the beginning, the study also explored what strategies leaders adopted and who they lent on for support to help them manage the emotional or the psychological challenge of being under lockdown. Public Health England published a set of recommendations to help individuals cope in lockdown, and we asked our participants which of these 13 suggestions they had adopted. The top 3 you can just about see include connecting with others, getting outside or bringing nature inside by opening windows, bringing in plants, or physical well-being and physical well-being. And that includes physical exercise and activities such as mindfulness and meditation. Then when we looked at who leaders were looking to for support during lockdown, the emphasis was very much on personal connections before professional ones. So most participants put personal connections first, and after that there was an emphasis on what we refer to as managing up. So CEOs were looking to their boards for support, executive teams were looking to their CEOs, and so on. And this pattern of looking upwards for support isn't particularly surprising. In terms of resources, most participants looked to colleague networks. So once again, the emphasis on social support was really strong. And following that, it was encouraging actually to us to see leaders engaging in webinars, socials, online learning and training as well. It's really easy to become insular and single-minded in times of crises. So we felt it was a positive thing that leaders were looking out for support and for opportunities to develop new perspectives and gain fresh insights. But within this data, we did find some leaders in some organizations really engaged, and in other organizations, they didn't at all. And some of the feedback we've had from HR directors in these organizations is that these particular leaders who don't engage see the initiatives as being set up to support colleagues and not necessarily them. So therefore, the culture of the organization may start to influence how readily leaders engage in these support activities. And it's actually really important that they do, because role modeling is one of the most important levers affecting organizational culture. So if leaders are proactive in engaging in activities and interactions, supporting their mental health and their well-being, this is likely to have a positive impact on their organization at large. And one final observation I'd like to pull out is around leadership style. And we used an inventory that determined whether leaders adopted a democratic, a laissez-faire, or an autocratic style of leadership during lockdown. Those who adopted a more democratic style of leadership were at a lower risk of burnout. And this also had a positive impact on those being managed in a more democratic way, as it builds a sense of empowerment and it builds self-efficacy as a result. And this ties in neatly with previous research, actually, that suggests that strong social support from leadership lowers perceptions of stress and burnout in employees in the organization. So I'm going to finish with a few recommendations before passing back to Ian and on to Laura. And we spent a lot of time debriefing participant organizations on our overall findings as well as their organizational data set. And our conversations boil down to 3 main recommendations. The first is around education. And we encourage you to educate yourselves on 2 levels. First, understand yourself better. And second, understand burnout and stress better. So what are the situations that you might feel most challenged in? When does stress become distress for you? And what are your triggers? And how well you can identify your triggers and the emotional and physical symptoms of burnout and poor mental health is key to being able to address them successfully. Perhaps you've not been sleeping well recently. Is that because you need a new mattress, or might it be influenced by stress? So learn about the varying symptoms of stress, but also the environment or situations where you might feel most challenged in. Our second recommendation is to engage. This means asking for help or simply just talking about things. And in talking, you're beginning to process your thoughts and emotions in a more cognitive way, which enables you to address them more effectively. It also helps build emotional connections with others, which we already know has played an important role in coping during lockdown. And I mentioned just now that role modeling is the single most effective lever for driving cultural change. So the more leaders have these types of conversations, the more this will happen through the organization. And finally, explore. Explore different ways to promote good psychological well-being. Explore techniques and tools that could help build personal resilience and develop your neuroplasticity. I know I don't really need to tell you that last point because that's obviously why we're all here. But I hope that these 3 points do resonate with you, and I hope that you found our data interesting and useful. And this is probably a good time to pass on to Laura to perhaps educate ourselves around and explore some useful tools to support mental well-being. Thank you for listening.
Gemma, that was wonderful. In normal times, there'd be a round of applause. I always find at this point it's really annoying that we're not all, you can't get that feedback. But no, that was superb, Gemma. Particularly, I think that the point you made about role modeling. If people take anything away today, have a look at yourself. Think about how you're responding to this, and appearing strong and impervious isn't always the right way to deal with stuff. So yeah, let's move on because we need help, especially if you're a young female leader, according to the research. So Laura, help us. My Happy Mind, how can you help us out?
Well, thank you for having me, and fascinating to hear that research brought to life. Thank you. Just by way of a short introduction, I am the founder of My Happy Mind, which is an NHS-backed organisation dedicated to building resilience, self-esteem and happiness in children, teachers, parents, and in organisations as well. So our mission is very much about bringing the science and research around happiness into the mainstream, with a particular focus on education. And the reason for that, which I think is really relevant to this ongoing conversation, is that for too long now, in my opinion, conversations around mental health have started from a place of deficit and have been reactively grounded. What I mean by that is when we talk about mental health, we tend to be talking about things like stress, anxiety, burnout, as opposed to exploring happiness and well-being. And so what we do is we focus on educating in a very proactive way. What are those things that we know from the science and we know from the research contribute to good mental health? And there's some of the perspectives that I wanted to kind of share today. Against what I think we've heard loud and clear is a really interesting backdrop of us all moving from this place of being very much in firefighting and survival mode to recognizing there is some light at the end of this tunnel, and it's time to start rebuilding. But I think it's really, really important for leaders, for organizations, and for us as individuals to take adequate time to pause. And the reason I think that pause is so important is that, as Lou said earlier, we know that people don't necessarily want to just snap back to the way things were before. We've learned so many lessons, both in terms of efficiency, balance in work and other things about what this lockdown has shown us, and we want to make sure we retain that. And so I think the first thing that I would offer around what does that pause look like is that there's really an opportunity for organizations at the kind of the macro level, but also leaders and employees at the individual level to recalibrate and to recontract on what this next phase of our journeys looks like. And I think it's critical to do that with the lens of mental health and well-being at the core, because the truth is that people won't just snap back. I'm doing so much work at the moment with heads and with the NHS looking at the return to school. And, you know, even the language we've used around that as a society, you know, it's time to catch up, instantly puts on this kind of negative connotation that children are behind. There's a problem that we need to fix, rather than choosing language around, let's just get back to it, right? Let's just get back on the horse and move forward in a positive way. And I think there's a lot to be said for really thinking about our language and our expectations around that bounce back, because for children returning to school and for adults returning to the workforce, it's not going to be as simple from a mental health perspective of, we're back to normal now. You know, I'm back in the office. I can go and get a pret-a-manger at lunch again, or for a child, I'm back at school. There will be a hangover from a mental health perspective for some time. And it's really important, I think, particularly from an organizational perspective, that we are aware of that and we're thinking about that. And we don't just kind of take on this view of, we're back to normal now. The second thing that is a conversation I find myself having all of the time, and it's a really important one, is in the need for organizations to think about mental health and well-being. And I saw somebody in the chat called it mental fitness, which I love, to think about that from a proactive perspective and not just a reactive perspective. This is the case in schools, and it's the case in organizations often, that we think about what are the interventions we need to put in place for those who are struggling the most. And that's fine, and that's important. So whether it's a counselling line for employees, or it's, you know, additional time off if you're having a tough time, that's all great and that's all important, but it's highly reactive. And the truth about mental health is that the people who are often suffering the most are the ones who are suffering in silence. It's the same for children and for adults. And that's why proactive interventions, which are informed by the science of happiness and well-being, are so, so important for organizations to be looking at, as well as that reactive piece. And then the two kind of final reflections I wanted to offer, because I know we'll all be keen, I'm sure, to get to Q&A. The first is very much linked to the research that's just been shared around this idea that vulnerability builds trust in organizations. And so if leaders are able to share their stories, as we've seen borne out in that data, share their own experiences of lockdown, share where they are with the broader workforce, they are much more likely to be able to get into powerful and engaging discussions about what we can do differently moving forward. So one reflection is, how as leaders can you do that in your organization and build on that vulnerability to build that trust? And then the second piece, which is very much linked to that, is on an ongoing basis, what can you do as an organization to create a culture of openness and trust? I think it's been a really fascinating dynamic that for many of us, all of a sudden, when we first went into lockdown, our lives kind of merged in a way that they never really had before. Whether you're a working parent or not, all of a sudden, you know, your entire team could see into your tidy bit of your house that you'd kind of made look nice from the back, in a way that they'd never done before. And so we used to have this real separation, if we chose, between work and home, and that's been obliterated through this process. And I think that's brought some benefits. I think it's removed quite a lot of barriers, even if just psychological. You know, the dog barks in the background, or the child comes in asking for help with their maths, or whatever it might have been. But how do we sustain that? Because that's had some real wins, I think, for many people. But what's going to be really critical is we sustain it, not least because when it comes to talking about mental health, if people feel more comfortable and more connected, they will do that so much more than if they're back into kind of more of a formal work relationship. So they were some reflections I wanted to share, which I hope is useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. That sets us up lovely for the Q&A, I think. One reflection from our work in the Good Employment Charter, and I loved Gemma's reference to adrenaline, because I think everybody ran very quickly initially, and the number of people went, oh, we've been thinking about flexible work for a while, and hey, we've done it, hey, we're brilliant. But they weren't. All they did was throw them a laptop, and so many pictures, we've seen them on the internet, of particularly young people sitting on the edge of beds in shared houses using an ironing board as a desk. And, you know, frankly intolerable. And whilst we think we've cracked flexible work, all we've done is shifted work to home. And there's a huge amount of work we've still to do on what flexible work really means, and particularly taking the issues around the impact on women, particularly over the last year, has been enormous and disproportionate. And it's some of those inequalities that were always there, but have just been exaggerated greatly through what we've seen over the last year. So I think, Laura, you're bang on in that recalibration piece, particularly around health and well-being policies. If you look at health and well-being policies in most organizations, they talk about a fruit bowl, they talk about, you know, a gym class at lunchtime and a yoga. That's all out the window. You know, you need to really go back to basics and start thinking about what that really means. And I think one of the questions that Jenny will, maybe I'll come to Jenny's question. But David, I wanted to come to you really with the first question. And as I said to Gemma, you started this back in September, you published it back in September, reflecting on really like phase 1 of lockdown. And we've been to, you know, another couple and loads of uncertainty since. So how have things changed since then, perhaps? And then what's the depth of the damage that we've done? And then maybe your reflections on how we recover.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think the bad news is it hasn't really got much better. If anything, it's got worse. We would have loved to have repeated the piece of research that we did, but I think, you know, logistics and timing got a bit beyond us. However, we did do a pulse survey of a group of CEOs in January, and that pulse survey indicated that they were more concerned, more anxious than they had been in the initial findings that we found. And if you think back 2 or 3 months, we were getting reports of new variants of the virus. Perhaps the rollout of the vaccine hadn't accelerated to the point that we're at the moment. And so there was not a lot of great news on the horizon. I think when you added the anecdotal evidence of talking to a lot of senior leaders through coaching conversations or people that we talk to on a day-to-day basis, I think the winter lockdown has been really tough on people. You know, you both referenced, Gemma referenced the adrenaline, the excitement that happened when we went into lockdown, the shift to home working, the adaptability that people had to apply to their businesses to keep trading as much as something else, to manage their cash, etc., created a huge amount of energy. In the middle of December and January, that energy hasn't been there. It's also been pretty rubbish weather. And you know, the long nights and the short days have meant that it's been hard to go out and take exercise. Whereas if you recall, a year ago we went into quite a nice spring, and so you could go out for a nice walk in the sunshine after the working day. So I think all of this has compounded the impact, and so people are really struggling. So, you know, I feel we are into a period where the mental challenge and the mental well-being is going to be a serious challenge for leaders and for organizations over the next 6 to 9 months as we hopefully start to climb out of this situation.
Thanks, David. A realistic overview, but it is pessimistic, isn't it? I mean, that's where we are.
I'm an optimist, yeah.
Jenny's asked a question in the chat, and she reflects it's really great that we're taking it seriously. But how much should employers take responsibility for mental fitness, especially given the move to more hybrid, flexible working? So I think behind this question is, you know, it's a multifactorial thing, mental fitness and mental wellness. So how much responsibility should the employer take? Laura, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, happy to. And I think it's a great question, and probably a question that many organizations are asking themselves, because as we've described, this is something that is now very real. I think for a long time, as we've described, mental health has kind of been something that's only really got attention when it was a problem, right? So when somebody came forward and said, I'm really struggling, that's when employers would have hopefully stepped up and supported. But even then, I think there's this question around, but is that really a work thing, or is that something they should be dealing with their doctor? And so I think it's a brilliant question, because what it really gets to the heart of is the fact that there should be no distinction between mental fitness and employee performance. The two are inextricably linked. And given the massive trauma, and many will have experienced this lockdown as a trauma that we've all been through, I think it's absolutely paramount that organisations are thinking about the mental fitness of their employees, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it will have a positive knock-on effect on how quickly organizations get people back to peak performance. And before I started My Happy Mind, I was the global head of talent and development for AstraZeneca, who of course have been in the news a lot recently, and used to work with the CEO, Pascal Soireau, and his top 200 leaders on exactly this question, which was, how do we ensure that our leaders are absolutely the healthiest and the mentally fittest that they can possibly be? And it's looking at it from that perspective that's going to get the results. Not only is that going to support the individual in their day-to-day life, but it's going to help the organization as well. So I think it's absolutely front and center and part of an organization's responsibility.
Everyone was nodding all the way through that. I don't know, David, Gemma, have you got anything to add?
I would agree, absolutely. I think, you do have to take personal responsibility as well. I think if you had a headache, you'd go and take some paracetamol. So if you're not feeling well, you need to take personal responsibility. But absolutely, it should be front and center of the organizational agendas at the moment, not because of the issue that we're facing because of the pandemic, but because it's the right thing to do. This just has accelerated and accentuated the problem.
I'd like to move on to Rory's question, or he's probing really about some ways to measure the impact of wellbeing initiatives. How can we keep track of what works and what works less well? For our part, we've been working with the Health and Social Care Partnership, and later this month, or maybe next month, we'll be publishing a toolkit that will be helping employers to guide their way through some of these issues. But Lou, have you come across any businesses through your networks that do this, have got it right?
Yeah, I think what's interesting as the conversations shifted, I guess, is businesses traditionally spend a lot of their energy, I guess, in an outward-facing conversation about customer happiness, polling where the kind of customer mood is. And I think actually what we're seeing increasingly is, in my design-orientated universe, what we think of as users, more recognition of the internal team as users and a key audience and a key stakeholder. So I think we're definitely starting to see that. And I know there's a question about kind of organizational design. I think the other part of that is then people treating this as a bit of a redesign moment, almost within their own organization, to say, actually, if the future is hybrid, then how are we going to organize, as you said, David? It's not just, well, there's your laptop and then that's problem solved. Actually, there's a whole redesign of culture, ways of working, and some of that's quite micro in terms of how do you use WhatsApp? How do you use Slack? How do we redesign that whole picture of what the future of work looks like to reflect the bits that we might have enjoyed about lockdown and keep those and those things that have been good for the organization, but also, to make the best of when we can physically come back together again, where do we use those moments? How do we get the most out of those? So I think we're largely in a big redesign moment, but recognizing increasingly, as we're seeing happening, the internal team as a key user and a key stakeholder and a key part of that.
Thanks, Lou. I want to move on to Neil's question because I think it's fascinating. We've got some views on this. Do we think that company structures, models of business may change to accommodate the deeper engagement with employees? Employee ownership models, perhaps, to gain traction? David, you're nodding.
Well, I think it's been a fascinating experience. I'd come back to some of the points that Laura touched on. I think what lockdown has done is it has forced leaders to become more inclusive and to be more curious about people's situations and circumstance. As you say, if you hear the dog barking, the child asking for help with their homework or whatever it is, you've got a much better idea and sense of what the situation and circumstance is for that particular individual. So it's driven a greater sense of inclusion in good leadership, or it should have driven a greater sense of inclusion. So I think if that then translates to company structures and business models, that and you want to really drive a greater sense of employee engagement, then why wouldn't you look at new and different models to gain more traction? I think it's a really interesting idea and thought, and so it would not be at all surprising, particularly in the SME market, to sort of see businesses looking at how do they engage and really capture the energy that they have. I mean, we saw what McKinsey called a democratization of decision making, a real empowerment, and Gemma talked about it in the leadership style, real empowerment into organizations through this pandemic. So it would be an awful shame if we just let that slip.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Goodness, another pound in the jar. I was asking Laura, Gemma, and Lou if you wanted to come in on that.
I'm happy to jump in, and I think absolutely yes is the answer too. I think it's back to this opportunity that businesses have to pause and to recalibrate, and I think that cuts across everything. As Lou said, it cuts across how they engage with customers, how they engage with employees, how things like comp and ben is looked at, how they're engaging in the mental fitness of their employees, all of it. I think all of this has been a fantastic opportunity, or presents a fantastic opportunity, I should say, to pause and to recalibrate. And I think that's a really important takeaway from this, is that we don't just jump straight back in and bounce back to the way things were, because we'll miss such a critical opportunity to build back better, as GM are doing and talking about.
I find the question from Neil really fascinating. In the work that we've been doing with the Charter, we've engaged with a number of employee-owned businesses, and goodness, they've been resilient. They haven't complained. They've got on with it. They've had that sense of togetherness, looking after everyone, and they've thrived on the back of it. One had the best trading year for ages, but not because the market changed, because they had the values set right at the top. And I think that's why it's so important to have Gemma and David here today from the School of CEOs to build on that message and how you communicate with leaders. We're coming close to the end of our time here, but Joe asked a very pithy question to end. What one thing can leaders do today to help practically with their teams? So we'll go around everyone. Gemma, let's start with you.
Thanks, Ian. I would say take the lead and start the conversation, because it's very difficult for someone else to bring up a conversation around mental health. But if you can take the lead and start that conversation, then you might need to express a little bit of vulnerability, and that takes courage. But if you can do that, I think it will pay dividends in terms of building those emotional connections and trust in your team, and that sense of togetherness that's really important in supporting your well-being. Thanks,
Gemma. Laura?
Sorry, just finding the mute button. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Start the conversation, but I would build on that and say, make no assumptions. It's really easy for a leader to think that, well, you've got kids and they're back at school now, so you're going to be okay now, or this is your set of scenarios, therefore this. And so I would do exactly that, but with this backdrop of making no assumptions about what you think that person may or may not be going through.
David, can I come to you?
Yeah, I'd say, and it's building on, I guess, a little bit of what Laura and Gemma said, but be curious. Be really curious about your teams, and as you said, don't take things for granted.
Lou, I'm going to come to you and then maybe ask a supplemental to you, Lou, about what next. What more can people expect from Greater Manchester to support business on this agenda?
So I think in answer to the question, I would build on what everyone's said already and say, actually, I think as leaders, the best thing we can do is remain open-minded as to what the answer might be, because it might be something that none of us have ever tried before. And I think now is the moment to do that. So I think certainly from a Greater Manchester perspective, obviously as the LEP and working closely with GMCA and the Growth Company and all of our partners, we're definitely shifting gear into economic recovery. So I think what we've described today, from we had a period where we were dealing with crisis and we were running on adrenaline. There's definitely been a shift in gear now, which is we have to get back to whether it's in line with the roadmap or otherwise, I guess, to be confirmed really, but we know that we're going to be moving back into a different phase of economic recovery. I think for us, our work streams are going to be anchored around that North Star, which is being inclusive and working for the planet and for all people. So I think whilst we'll remain focused on that North Star, there's definitely out of crisis mode into economic recovery mode is definitely the tone as we head into maybe not out of crisis mode.
There you go. That's the puppy's cage gone, but never mind. Only really thanks, Lou. It only remains for me to thank you all. Thank you, Lou. Thanks, Gemma, David, and Laura. While you've been chatting, I did find. There you go. Can you hear that? Round of applause. There you go. It is frustrating that we can't all applaud. Wonderful presentations. It was a really good 45 minutes. I hope everyone's taken something away from it. Thanks for attending. If you can, on the side before you leave, complete the polls. I think the polls should be up there shortly, just so that you can give us some feedback. And hope it just remains for me to say have a great day. Thanks very much, guys.